you're trying to send by putting me on the extreme left side of this panel. I'll just say I'll be comfortable to start at. We'll see where we end up. But indeed, as Christina said, the U.S. government has put climate change, has identified it as a strategic threat to our security, to our prosperity. And what I'd like to do is take a look at that threat and the risks that it poses through the lens of natural resource scarcity. And as you know, climate change does not unfold on the world like a big cloud of fog. It just sort of settles in everywhere and gets into your bones. No, it's highly differentiated in how it affects communities and individuals and countries. And you can ask the question, in order to understand that, how climate change affects people, ask the question, will people have access to water, to productive land, to fish, to forests, and other natural resources as climate change deepens its hold on the human enterprise? And what is very clear is that when people do not have those resources, they move. They migrate in some cases. They move whole communities in search of water, in search of productive lands. But they also move other ways. They move politically, and they move with governments. They move without governments. They turn first to their own governments and say, can you respond to this lack, to this challenge we have to our livelihoods, to our existence? And if government can't respond, they take other paths. And what I'm going to talk about today are some of the paths that both communities as well as countries are taking as resources are becoming more scarce. Now, we need to remember that as we enter this period regarding resource scarcity, we are in a period that's really unknown to the human enterprise. The global population is growing at a remarkable rate and drawing down natural resources for survival. Second, the global economy is growing, and as it grows and as living standards rise, there's also greater demand for natural resource input. And third, we have been living in periods of abundance, and the policies and the institutions that were crafted and built during that period no longer satisfy, are no longer acceptable. They don't work anymore. And it requires fundamental change in policies and in institutions, and moving way beyond the issues of corruption that have undergirded in many, many countries the question of access to natural resource wealth. So climate change is going to deepen. It's going to accelerate these impacts. And I'd like to give you 5 pathways through which those impacts will take hold on this planet and create threats. Direct challenges to U.S. security, prosperity, and security interests, and I'd say to the world writ large. So the first of those pathways is through internal destabilization, internal instability. Christine evoked the example of Syria, the Syrian civil war. The drought began in 2006. It continued up through 2011. 2 to 3 million people moved. 1.5 million people lost their livelihoods in rural areas. And it precipitated a rural to urban migration that was a significant contributing factor to the Civil War. But let me ask you that, and indeed that has considerable impacts here in the continent. But think also about Pakistan. Pakistan is a country that is possessed by a national security ideology. The budget is structured around its security perceptions to India, to Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Resources have not been invested into the environment for many years, and consequently, you have long overdue structural reform. The landed aristocracy, the semi-feudal aristocracy, controls the land, controls the water, controls the forests, and what that means is that the rural people, the young coming up in the countryside, do not have opportunities for sustainable livelihoods. So where do they move? They go to Islamabad, they go to Karachi, and there the enticements of ideological promises are very strong. Keep your eyes on Pakistan. It is in many ways sketched out that future in what has happened in Syria. The second pathway that I'd like to talk about is what I would call transboundary tensions. And indeed here, for many, many decades, the conflict between Israel, between the Palestinians, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan have really shaped the life in that part of the world. Right now, Israel controls and expanded through the Six-Day War, expanded its territory fourfold, and expanded its access to water twofold. And at the present time, Israelis, including the settlers, receive 6 times as much water on a daily basis as do the Palestinians. And yet, consider the fact that only 3% of Israel's GDP is derived from agriculture. Yet 40% of that water that it extracts from aquifers that are under the occupied territories are used for agriculture. There's an imbalance, there's a distortion here that really is not sustainable, obviously. Talk about water, that's one example. Another example are what are called land grabs. Hardly need to remind you of the ill-fated enterprise of leasing out 1/3 of Madagascar's agricultural land to Daewoo, the large South Korean conglomerate. Well, it didn't take very long for the public to unveil this corrupt behavior and actually depose their president. And you know certainly of other land grab relationships, South Africa and Congo, Oman and Ethiopia, and so forth. This is about gaining control of natural resources in a resource-scarce world. The third pathway that I'd like to talk to you about very briefly then is creating regional instability. When the Chinese government overthrew the Kuomintang in 1949, it issued something called the 9-dash line that demarcates its claim through the South China Sea. Well, little did they care at that point that that 9-dash line cut across the extended economic zones of 7 countries of the region. Well, why is it then, ask yourselves, why is it that today the Chinese government is reinforcing its claim of the 9-dash line? And why is it that the Chinese government tried to establish the oil extraction rig in Vietnamese territory? Why is it that in 2012 there were multiple conflicts over fishing rights and sinking of Filipino boats? The point is that this is the world's fastest growing economy, largest economy very soon, and that it needs fish protein for its people and it needs hydrocarbon to fuel its growing industrial foundations. Natural resource scarcity. I could also invoke in this sense what is happening with the Boko Haram in the parts of the sub-Saharan Africa that is often portrayed really as a conflict between anti-Westerners and Islamic extremism and so forth. But underlying that is a conflict between the pastoralists, the Arab pastoralists, looking for water, looking for grazing ground, and the Christian agriculturalists who are trying to defend that territory, interwoven with religious overtones, with extremist claims and so forth. The fourth way that I'd like to talk about quickly are what we're calling the disruption of global supply chains. This was the prototypical example of this is the Arab Spring, in which we experienced a spike in global wheat prices associated with droughts in droughts in Ukraine, Russia, also in Australia, and floods in the US and Canada that really disrupted and forced an increase in global wheat prices. That then, over time, the importing countries so dependent on those grains were not able to afford the imports, led to riots in more than 40 countries, and left over 130 million people on the edge of extreme poverty because they were unable to access the food that they needed at that time. That's sort of like the prototypical example. I'd like to ask you to consider what is happening in Brazil, one of the largest producers of soybeans at the present time. There was in 2005 a 100-year drought in the Amazon. In 2010, there was a second 100-year drought. In 2012, there was also a significant decline in the rainfall in that country. And what happened? Well, basically, a great deal of the trees in the region suffered permanent damage. It's not surprising then at this time that Sao Paulo is lacking the water, the reserves that it needs to guarantee its water security and electricity security in years to come. And the final pathway that I'd like to mention then is what we call the fueling of global criminal syndicates. When people need resources to survive, they will do whatever they have to obtain them, whether it's through illegal fishing, whether it's through the massacre of 35,000 elephants in Africa, whether it's through gold and blood diamonds and so forth. And these chains of obtaining and using natural resources are the liquid end of global criminal syndicates that also fuel and support international commerce of humans, of drugs, and of arms. So anyhow, those are some of the areas in which I think we need to be watching the U.S. response to these challenges. The responses are emerging. Watch what happens in the South China Sea. It's not very clear how they're going to stop, quote, the island building. And watch what happens in other parts of the world where there are very direct threats of various countries to the resources that they need to survive.